Have you ever wondered what truly allowed the smaller, lighter German fighters to tear apart American heavy bombers, massive machines weighing tens of thousands of pounds in just a few seconds? It was not numbers. It was not size. It was something far more unsettling. A tiny weapon that looked too small to be taken seriously, yet delivered destruction far beyond its appearance. That weapon was the MG-131, a 13mm machine gun that seemed almost modest at first glance, but fired nearly 1,000 explosive rounds per minute, each one acting like a miniature bomb the instant it touched metal, mounted directly in the nose of fighters like the Bf-109 and the FW-190. The MG-131 did not simply fire. It ripped, punched, and ignited. A short burst could shred a bomber's wing like wet paper, punch straight through fuel tanks, and set an entire aircraft ablaze in the span of a heartbeat. This deceptively small weapon created one of the strangest, most frightening paradoxes in the air war over Europe. The smaller the gun, the deadlier the sky became. And to understand why it became one of the most feared weapons faced by American air crews, we have to return to the moment when everything changed. The severely damaged heavy bomber, limping back on only 2 functioning engines and sheer pilot determination, eventually managed to make a rough, unscheduled landing at a large coalition airbase on the nearby islands. Immediately upon its arrival, highly specialized post-flight analysis teams moved into action to assess the unprecedented destruction. These teams included experienced air mechanics, dedicated ordnance specialists, and field intelligence officers from the Allied nations. They began meticulously examining the crippled bomber with painstaking, minute care, urgently looking for any clues to the mysterious and novel damage patterns. These professionals were intimately familiar with the common, expected signature of the enemy aerial firepower they had faced for years. This typically included the precise, heavy punch of the larger 20mm cannon rounds, or the high, sustained rate of fire from the older 7.9 2mm rifle caliber machine guns. But the physical damage on this particular 4-engine aircraft was shockingly inconsistent with any known, established weapon signature they had catalogued. The size of the entry and exit wounds were clearly too large for the standard rifle caliber machine gun fire they were accustomed to observing. Yet, they were simultaneously too concentrated and too densely packed on the fuselage for the slower-firing 20mm cannon. Crucially, the resulting kinetic energy transfer and the intense, localized explosive force observed within the airframe were unbelievably high for what appeared to be a mere heavy machine gun. The damage experts were left completely puzzled by the inherent paradox they observed. The high rate of fire, typical of a machine gun, was somehow combined with the powerful explosive yield expected only from a much larger cannon. The coalition intelligence officers knew instantly they were facing a critical new technological development from the defending nation, one that demanded immediate and accurate identification. The operational implications for the entire bomber campaign were considered dire and immediate. The answer to this destructive paradox lay deep within the industrial heart of the continental nation, specifically in the very aircraft production factories the bomber force was desperately attempting to destroy. By 1943, the main enemy air force was fighting fiercely against the tide of the inevitable, locked in a desperate, existential technological arms race with the massive manufacturing power of the coalition. The coalition forces were fielding increasingly robust, heavier bomber aircraft. These large aircraft were protected by ever thicker armor plate and advanced, resilient, segmented self-sealing fuel tanks, making them exceptionally difficult targets to engage. The standard enemy fighter armament, the old 7.9 2mm machine gun, was rapidly becoming tactically irrelevant against the latest bomber designs. It was relegated to little more than a nuisance against these powerful, well-defended behemoths. While the existing 20mm cannons were undeniably deadly and effective, their inherent bulk, weight, and complex recoil systems often required cumbersome, external installations on the interceptor aircraft. These external additions, such as drag-inducing underwing gun pods, severely compromised the critical speed, altitude performance, and high-altitude dogfighting maneuverability of their key interceptors. This was a particular problem for their widely used, versatile single-engine fighter design. The defending nation's high command urgently demanded a weapon that could deliver a heavy, explosive punch, but in a remarkably light, compact, and aerodynamically clean package. The solution that their engineers finally delivered was the MG-131, developed and produced by a major armaments firm. This new weapon had been quietly conceived in the late 1930s. However, it was in 1942 and 1943 that it finally began its wide-scale operational deployment as a critical frontline armament on all new interceptor aircraft. This weapon was fundamentally a heavy 13mm machine gun, yet it was deceptively small in stature. It measured less than 4 feet long and weighed only 20 kilograms, approximately 44 pounds. This made it uniquely light for its destructive caliber, a huge advantage for stealthy fighter integration. This critical lightness and compact size were absolutely crucial to its success and rapid deployment. The primary single-engine fighter of the defending nation was, by design, a very tightly packed, high-performance airframe. The MG-131 was specifically engineered to be light and short enough to be mounted entirely inside the engine cowling, right above the engine block. This sophisticated mounting allowed the gun to fire safely through the spinning propeller arc via a synchronization gear. This highly coveted and aerodynamically clean cowl gun arrangement was the key to maintaining fighter performance. In the powerful alternative fighter design used by the enemy, it was often installed as the primary pair of guns situated above the engine. This provided a devastating core punch when tactically paired with the more powerful 20mm external wing root cannons carried by that aircraft type. The new weapon acted as the essential foundation for the heavier fighter's powerful mixed-caliber armament. But the physical size and low weight were not the gun's most lethal secrets. The weapon's astonishing rate of fire was equally crucial to its success as a bomber-destroyer. The MG-131 boasted a blistering cyclic rate of nearly 9 to 150 rounds per minute. This mechanical torrent significantly outpaced most other conventional heavy weapons of its physical size. When two synchronized cowl guns were operating together, they could pour almost 2,000 rounds a minute of 13mm ammunition into a designated target area. Yet, even this impressive rate of fire paled in comparison to the true ugly secret of the weapon: the specialized projectile it was firing. The enemy ordnance engineers had successfully married the high velocity and rapid rate of a machine gun with the disproportionate explosive payload of a small cannon. The resulting rounds, particularly the infamous Minengeschoss mine shell, were what truly terrified and profoundly confounded the coalition aircrews. These specialized shells utilized a revolutionary thin-walled steel casing that was spun with walls that were engineered to be incredibly thin, almost minimalist in structure. This key design choice permitted the maximum possible internal volume to be reserved entirely for the high-performance explosive filler. This meant that while the external dimensions were a modest 13mm, the resulting shell contained significantly more powerful high-explosive material than any comparable coalition round of the same physical size. It was this potent combination, rapid, lightweight, and highly explosive firepower, that was now drastically and lethally changing the dynamic of individual aerial engagements against the bomber fleets. Coalition pilots and gunners, trained to anticipate either heavy, slow 20mm bursts or light, ineffective 7.92mm streams, were suddenly being shredded by an unexpected torrent of explosive 13mm rounds. They had no established doctrine or defense to counter. The official intelligence reports from post-mission debriefings started urgently flagging the new threat across coalition command channels. Bewildered airmen and gunners repeatedly referred to oversized machine gun fire and explosive rounds from the nose. The coalition forces were about to learn just how hard and how efficiently the new interceptor teeth, in the form of the compact, destructive MG-131, could bite into the heavily defended bomber formations. The sudden, catastrophic destruction witnessed on the returning bombers was immediately recognized as a novel threat. The damage patterns analyzed on the forensic tables of the coalition airbases quickly defied all established understanding of aerial combat ballistics. This new type of weapon created a unique, profoundly lethal hybrid threat. It delivered a dense, terrifying swarm of impacts, firing at a rate nearing 1,000 rounds per minute. Yet, each individual impact carried an explosive punch vastly greater than its modest 13mm caliber suggested to the puzzled analysts. The core of this terrifying escalation in lethality lay in the unique enemy ingenuity in ordnance design. The Minengeschoss, or mine shell. The concept stemmed from a deceptively simple, yet utterly revolutionary design philosophy formulated by the engineers of the defending nation years earlier. Most traditional anti-aircraft and aircraft cannon shells used thick, heavy walls of steel to contain both the propellant and the explosive filler. This thick-walled construction was essential to ensure high kinetic penetration and maintain structural integrity during the high-velocity flight path toward the target. The enemy designers deliberately and radically rejected this established design philosophy. They posed a critical question to themselves. What if they entirely sacrificed deep kinetic penetration in exchange for maximizing the internal explosive payload and the resulting blast yield? The engineers concluded that maximizing explosive effect was the fastest way to destroy a bomber. The answer materialized specifically as the 13mm Minengeschoss round, meticulously designed to be fired by the MG-131. Its steel casing was spun with walls that were engineered to be incredibly thin, almost minimalist in structure. This key design choice critically permitted the internal volume to be maximized almost entirely for the specialized high-explosive filler. This meant that while the external dimensions were a modest 13mm, the resulting shell contained significantly more powerful high-explosive material than any equivalent coalition round of the same physical size. Furthermore, the explosive filler itself was not standard, less potent TNT. It was a high-performance, potent mixture, often a sophisticated blend of RDX and TNT, which conferred upon the shell an extreme and decisive detonation velocity upon contact with the target's skin. When this highly specialized, thin-walled shell impacted the comparatively thin aluminum skin of a coalition bomber, it was engineered not to rely upon kinetic energy or deep mechanical penetration. Instead, the fragile casing would instantly rupture upon striking the surface. This impact caused the internal charge to detonate, vaporizing into a powerful shockwave and an immediate, furious spray of incandescent, superheated shrapnel that tore through the surrounding structure. This was not merely a mechanical failure upon impact. This was, in practical effect, the detonation of a miniature, powerful high-explosive landmine occurring right on the surface of the aircraft's critical structure. The resulting effect on the target was nothing short of catastrophic and decisively destructive. A single, standard coalition half-inch armor-piercing round might punch cleanly through a self-sealing fuel tank, potentially leaving only a manageable, controllable leak. However, a Minengeschoss 13mm round would strike the tank, explode externally, and instantly tear a jagged, secondary hole, often many times larger than the original caliber. This external explosion virtually guaranteed that the fuel tank failed completely, often leading to a spectacular, rapid, and uncontrollable fire that consumed the aircraft. Against an exposed crewman, such as a bomber gunner, the intense blast wave and the superheated shrapnel that tore through the cockpit glass and surrounding bulkheads was, with heartbreaking frequency, immediately and irrevocably fatal. This fundamental and radical difference in design philosophy made the MG-131, despite its surprisingly moderate size, an overwhelmingly efficient bomber killer for the enemy interceptors. A coalition heavy bomber was structurally designed to absorb dozens of hits from conventional machine guns without immediate operational failure. It was utterly unprepared and completely unequipped to withstand concentrated, repeated volleys of miniature explosive shells that detonated powerfully on impact, ripping and tearing the airframe. For the interceptor pilots, the fighter wings of the defending nation, this new weapon immediately meant a massive and decisive shift in successful operational tactics. Prior to the widespread deployment of the MG-1 B-21 in late 1942 and 1943, an enemy pilot flying a high-performance fighter typically needed almost superhuman precision and considerable flight endurance to achieve a kill. They previously had to close to extremely short range, often less than 100 meters, and stay firmly on target for several precious, heart-stopping seconds to pump enough conventional 7.92mm or 20mm rounds into the tough, armored coalition aircraft to guarantee a decisive destruction. This necessary prolonged exposure was incredibly dangerous for the attacker. It gave the massed, integrated bomber gunners time to accurately find their range and return concentrated defensive fire with their own deadly half-inch machine guns. The MG-131 changed the calculus of aerial engagement entirely and dramatically shifted the tactical advantage back to the attacking fighter. Now, an enemy pilot could fire a devastating, extremely dense burst of explosive rounds from a significantly greater, safer distance, perhaps 300 meters. They could execute a lightning-fast, high-speed pass with vastly reduced risk to their own aircraft and crew. They needed only a 1 or 2 second burst, a mere 30 to 40 rounds, to inflict critical, mission-ending damage that often guaranteed structural failure or immediate ignition. This short, decisive burst critically minimized their exposure time to the concentrated defensive fire of the bomber formation. This was the key to the new hit-and-run tactics rapidly adopted across the enemy fighter wings. The fighter pilots would dive out of the sun, saturate a target bomber with the rapid-fire 13mm rounds, and be long gone, disappearing into the clouds or the high-speed dive, before the coalition bomber gunners could effectively track and return concentrated fire. The MG-131 was not just a powerful weapon, it was a highly effective tactical tool that perfectly fit the defending nation's urgent need for an economical, high-impact aerial solution. Its combination of compactness, a high rate of fire, and devastating explosive effect made it the most important aerial machine gun the enemy air force introduced to counter the mounting power of the coalition bomber offensive, a weapon whose destructive nature profoundly defied its surprisingly modest physical size. The historical narrative of the MG-131 is not solely about advanced ordnance. It is fundamentally a compelling story of engineering compromise and profound efficiency, dictated entirely by the severe and unforgiving aerodynamic constraints of the enemy fighter airframes. The central challenge faced by the interceptor designers was unique and complex. They had to figure out how to dramatically increase lethal firepower without simultaneously crippling the speed, climb rate, and overall performance of the sleek, high-altitude interceptors that formed the essential backbone of the enemy air force. This was a technological conundrum. The designers solved with a weapon that prioritized compact lethality over brute force. Their legendary single-engine fighter, especially the later variants, was a masterpiece of ingenious, lightweight engineering dating back to the late 1930s. It was deliberately designed to be small, light, and blindingly fast, built tightly around its powerful engine. But this very compactness was its primary operational limitation when attempts were made to scale up the necessary anti-bomber firepower. Fitting heavy cannons was consistently a mechanical engineer's nightmare due to the lack of available space and weight restrictions in the tight frame. The standard 20mm cannon, while undeniably effective, often required bulky, external installations, the infamous underwing gun pods. These pods undeniably delivered substantial firepower, but they were severe aerodynamic parasites. They created significant parasitic drag, consumed precious, limited fuel reserves rapidly, and critically slowed the aircraft down by as much as 30 kilometers per hour. More disastrously, they negatively impacted the fighter's high-altitude performance and made the aircraft sluggish, a catastrophic disadvantage when attempting to outmaneuver the fast, dedicated coalition escort fighters. The defenders needed firepower that didn't compromise their fighters' speed. This is precisely where the compact, unique genius of the MG-131 found its true historical and tactical purpose. It was perfectly sized and weighed, at approximately 44 pounds or 20 kilograms, to be fitted completely and cleanly inside the tight confines of the nose cowling. This highly desirable placement, situated right above the fighter's engine block, allowed the gun to fire safely and accurately through the spinning propeller arc via a meticulously engineered synchronization gear. This sophisticated arrangement, known universally as cowl guns, was aerodynamically clean, meaning the primary fighter could retain its superb maximum speed, excellent high-altitude performance, and, most critically, its high rate of climb. All these were essential attributes for fast, high-altitude interception missions against the bombers. The typical offensive setup of the latest primary fighter variant perfectly illustrates this critical, calculated trade-off between power and performance. The aircraft generally carried two synchronized MG-131s in the nose, providing the dense core volume of explosive, high rate of fire rounds. This high-volume core was tactically augmented by a single, heavier 20mm cannon, a reliable model firing through the propeller hub, right through the engine itself. This specific configuration delivered a highly concentrated, devastating mixture of firepower without being forced to rely on any drag-inducing external pods. The MG-131 ensured immediate saturation and explosive blast effect via its mineshell ammunition, while the single-hub cannon provided the decisive, heavy kinetic punch to major structural elements. This combination represented the ultimate operational expression of the defending nation's doctrine, favoring concentrated, mixed-caliber firepower in a single, aerodynamically efficient fighter. The larger alternative fighter also benefited immensely from the MG-131, though its structure was slightly more forgiving due to its wider fuselage and robust wings. This powerful fighter was specifically designed with thick, robust wings that could easily accommodate multiple heavy cannons further out from the fuselage. Even so, the MG-131 still retained a critical place in the primary armament. It was often fitted in the wing root or over the engine, providing an absolutely necessary dense, rapid-fire core. For instance, a common variant of this alternative fighter could carry two MG-131 machine guns over the engine, supplementing four 20mm cannons strategically mounted in the wings. This fusion of weapons was a terrifying proposition for any bomber crew. This fusion meant that the moment a pilot opened fire, the target bomber was instantly saturated by an intense storm of 13mm explosive rounds. This dramatically increased the probability of igniting fuel cells or detonating internal ammunition storage before the heavier, slower-firing cannon rounds even struck. The 13mm rounds acted as an essential fire starter and a high-rate armor shredder, clearing the path for the heavier ordnance to do its work. Beyond its size and weight advantage, the MG-131 introduced a key technical feature that significantly improved its operational reliability, especially critical on the highly stressed, engine-mounted installations. It utilized an electrical firing system, which was a marked improvement over the older mechanical or pneumatic trigger systems common on previous weapons. This electrical primer ignition was necessary for the exacting, precise synchronization required when firing safely through the rapidly spinning propeller arc at high engine revolutions per minute. Crucially, it also offered better overall operational reliability and substantially reduced the potential for catastrophic jamming at the extreme high altitudes where temperatures were frigid and mechanical tolerances were tight. This enhanced reliability was a vital feature for fighter pilots who knew they had only a precious few seconds to deliver their ordnance before being forced to escape the inevitable heavy defensive fire from the bomber formations. In essence, the MG-131 allowed enemy engineers to effectively solve a fundamental, almost contradictory paradox of the air war. They figured out how to reliably destroy an increasingly tough, heavily defended four-engine bomber using a relatively small, single-engine fighter without critically compromising the fighter's essential speed and maneuverability. The successful, elegant answer was not found in designing a larger, heavier cannon, but rather in perfecting a smaller, lighter machine gun that fired a revolutionary, powerful explosive projectile. The 13mm weapon was the absolute essential compromise that maintained the enemy fighter's competitive edge in the rapidly escalating, bloody battle for decisive control of the skies over the continental nation in the critical years of 1943 and 1944. For several agonizing months, throughout late 1942 and the majority of 1943, the coalition intelligence community was profoundly baffled by the escalating, catastrophic, and often mysterious losses inflicted upon their heavy bomber fleets. The High Command received conflicting information that made accurate assessment almost impossible. The returning pilots and bomber gunners, frequently shell-shocked and operating on fumes, delivered chaotic, often conflicting reports from the air battles raging over strategically vital targets. The surviving crewmen spoke of instantaneous fire, shocking explosions, and catastrophic structural failures resulting from attacks that seemed entirely too brief and too quick to be genuinely effective. The damage patterns analyzed on the airframes that limped back were utterly erratic and profoundly confusing to ordnance specialists. The impact holes were clearly too large and delivered with too much destructive force to be attributed to the ubiquitous, traditional 7.92mm machine guns. Yet they were simultaneously too concentrated and too rapid in succession to be solely the work of the slower-firing, recoil-heavy 20mm cannon. The evidence did not fit any known tactical or technological doctrine. Initially, many coalition analysts, relying heavily on historical precedents, skeptically dismissed the uniquely devastating damage signature. Some assumed the intense, localized explosions were merely the unfortunate result of standard 20mm cannon rounds impacting highly critical, flammable points within the airframe. These critical hits, such as oxygen tanks or ammunition storage boxes, consequently caused violent and uncontrollable secondary detonations. Others speculated that the desperate enemy pilots had perfected their aiming proficiency to an almost inhuman degree. They suggested the pilots were focusing all their existing cannon rounds into a tiny, vulnerable area, a near impossible feat under the intense stress of combat. But the sheer, physical volume of aircraft metal riddled with large, ragged, and distinctive holes continuously told a different, far more chilling story. This pattern screamed loudly of the introduction of a new, high-rate-of-fire explosive weapon that defied conventional classification. The crucial and definitive turning point came through the tedious, dangerous process of recovering actual physical evidence. After particularly heavy raids, ground recovery teams painstakingly searched the wreckage of downed enemy fighters near the battle lines. More importantly, they devoted countless hours to analyzing the extremely rare, intact, or semi-intact remnants of enemy ordnance recovered from downed coalition bombers that had crash-landed in friendly territory. Slowly, deliberately, and with painstaking patience, the ordnance teams pieced together the fragmented, metallic puzzle. They began finding small-caliber casings that were strangely distorted, unexpectedly thin-walled, and certainly did not match the heavy brass casings of their own standard half-inch ammunition. These artifacts were eventually identified as the spent casings for the 13mm round used by the MG-131. When intelligence ordnance experts finally realized the shocking truth that the enemy was successfully achieving a high explosive impact using a shell barely larger than their own, half-inch round, and critically, firing it at a comparable rate, the full scale and nature of the threat became terrifyingly clear. The highly unconventional Minengeschoss design was revealed as the key technical innovation behind the sudden increase in lethal efficiency. One detailed coalition intelligence report, dated late 1943, grimly described the enemy 13mm projectile as being an explosive projectile of the highest efficiency. This report starkly noted that the extremely thin-walled casing deliberately sacrificed kinetic penetration depth for a maximized explosive payload. The report concluded with a severe warning that the hits sustained from this unique weapon were out of all proportion to its caliber when compared directly to the effect of conventional coalition armor-piercing rounds. This chilling and definitive realization immediately forced a drastic, comprehensive change in coalition intelligence estimates, training protocols, and ultimately, operational planning. The main coalition air force could no longer rely solely on the sheer structural resilience and the existing light armor of their heavy bombers to absorb conventional machine gun fire, they were facing explosive saturation, a far more deadly phenomenon that threatened the structural integrity of the aircraft, the operational vulnerability of the aircraft's critical control surfaces, the comparatively unarmored engine areas, and the large, exposed fuel cells suddenly became paramount tactical concerns that demanded immediate addressing. The traditional defensive philosophy was obsolete. The psychological toll this grim intelligence took on the bomber crews was immense and profound. When airmen learned that the enemy was using rounds that literally detonated on the thin aluminum skin of their plane, instantly shattering localized armor and starting catastrophic fires, it fed directly into the growing, palpable terror of the daytime raids. The bomber crews were immediately urged to fly in ever tighter, more disciplined defensive formations, a structure known universally as the combat box. This incredibly tight packing concentrated their defensive half-inch fire, creating a dense, interlocking wall of lead that the enemy pilots had to physically punch through. This had to be done even when utilizing the tactical advantages provided by their new, effective MG-131 tactics. The design and implementation of countermeasures began in desperate earnest across coalition research centers. While redesigning an aircraft, mid-war was deemed an outright logistical impossibility, engineers scrambled for quick, effective battlefield fixes. One immediate and practical response was the urgent call for additional internal armor plate, particularly around the gun positions and the vital engine oil coolers. Both these areas were proving highly vulnerable to the concentrated 13mm explosions. They experimented with adding small, localized patches of plating in key areas where the MG-131 fire tended to concentrate its greatest effect, hoping to defeat the initial blast fragmentation. Though never offering a perfect, comprehensive solution, the official recognition and precise identification of the specific and unique threat posed by the MG-131 and its revolutionary explosive ammunition marked the essential and immediate first step towards strategically mitigating the catastrophic and unsustainable losses that characterized the darkest, most challenging period of the coalition daylight bombing campaign. The revelation marked a strategic low point, but also the beginning of the tactical fight back. The precise identification of the MG-131 as an immediate high-priority threat came just as the air war over the continental nation reached its terrifying, destructive, and bloody apex. Throughout late 1943 and extending into the crucial early months of 1944, the enemy air force was struggling fiercely to maintain daylight air superiority against the sheer numerical advantage of the coalition air forces. The sheer efficiency and devastating, localized destruction delivered by the deceptively modest 13mm weapon allowed the determined enemy pilots to inflict crippling, disproportionate damage relative to their declining operational numbers. This gun rapidly cemented its position as a central, indispensable component in the ferocious defensive battles fought over the deep, strategic targets within the heart of the nation. Consider the infamous, devastating raid on a major ball-bearing production center on October 14, 1943. The main coalition air force suffered astronomical, unprecedented losses. 60 heavy bombers were destroyed outright, and a further 138 were reported as severely damaged, a toll so heavy it resulted in the temporary suspension of all deep penetration bombing missions. While the heavier 20mm and 30mm cannons certainly accounted for the definitive final kills, the MG-131 was absolutely instrumental in preparing these targets for destruction. The exceptionally high rate of fire from the compact cowl guns saturated the bombers with explosive meningoscos rounds, quickly tearing out large sections of non-critical structure. This saturation instantly disabled vital internal systems like oxygen lines, delicate hydraulics, and essential control cables. Most crucially, the explosive blast started widespread, unstoppable fires that forced the doomed bombers to break formation and descend into the waiting guns of the enemy pilots below. A single primary enemy fighter, utilizing its powerful synchronized 13mm guns, could race through the massive bomber formation, deliver its decisive burst of explosives within 1 or 2 seconds, and leave a trail of crippled, smoking, and burning aircraft in its immediate wake. The operational tactic relied completely on raw speed, surprise, and the lethal punch of the explosive shell, a profile perfectly enabled by the MG-131's lightweight, low-drag installation. Enemy fighter pilots, whether flying the agile primary fighter or the robust alternative fighter, would execute a lightning dive from high altitude, maximizing their airspeed to minimize the critical time spent within the lethal, dense envelope of the bomber's defensive guns. They would strategically aim their deadly burst at the bomber's most vulnerable points: the wings, the engine nacelles, and the tail sections. The explosive nature of the 13mm round meant they did not necessarily need to achieve a direct hit on the heavily armored cockpit or the main fuselage to achieve a devastating result. Hitting an oil cooler, a control linkage, or a fuel line anywhere on the exposed wing was often sufficient to instantly turn the aircraft into a smoking wreck or a spectacular fireball. The enemy fighter pilots quickly and universally internalized the gun's profound effectiveness. The MG-131 was particularly favored on the primary fighter because it allowed the pilot to engage the enemy with tremendous, sustained firepower while flawlessly maintaining the aircraft's signature maneuverability. This trait became increasingly crucial when facing the escalating numbers of fast, dedicated coalition escort fighters. A single enemy pilot, flying a primary fighter equipped with the pair of nose-mounted 13mm guns and 120mm hub cannon, possessed a deadly and unique balance of mixed-caliber fire. Furthermore, the compact MG-131 was exceptionally reliable. Its parts were readily available across the occupied territories, and it required far less extensive maintenance in the field than the larger, heavier, and often more temperamental cannons. This superior mechanical reliability was an absolutely critical advantage for the overstretched enemy maintenance crews struggling to keep pace with the unsustainable operational tempo in 1944. The devastating, enduring role of the 13mm gun also extended significantly into the perilous domain of night fighting. As the coalition strategically increased their night bombing raids, the MG-131 was frequently and effectively utilized in the enemy night fighter force. Installed on heavier, twin-engine aircraft, like their night interceptors, the gun's high rate of fire and explosive impact were invaluable in the brief, chaotic, and often confusing encounters in the total darkness. When a night fighter pilot found a target, momentarily illuminated by searching ground searchlights or parachute flares, the pilot had only moments to acquire the target and fire effectively. The dense, explosive volley of the MG-131 ensured almost instantaneous hits and rapid ignition, giving the vulnerable bomber crew little to no chance to react before the devastating fire took an irreversible hold of the airframe. The operational ubiquity and proven combat effectiveness of the MG-131 meant that even as enemy design tragically moved towards increasingly specialized, heavier cannon armament like the 30mm on later interceptors, the reliable 13mm gun was resolutely retained in the aircraft's basic configuration. It was simply too effective, too lightweight, and too compact to ever be fully discarded from frontline service. It remained the core machine gun armament, the essential and necessary fire-starting weapon that delivered the preliminary, high-volume explosive saturation desperately needed to soften the toughest coalition bomber for the heavier, slower-firing cannon to deliver the final, crushing blow. The sheer number of coalition bomber casualties attributed to systems failure and fire, rather than outright disintegration from heavy cannon fire, stands as a grim testament to the MG-131's lethal impact. The pilots who flew the most intense missions during this period understood the weapon's vital role. They knew the success of their short, brutal attacks relied on the initial, tearing volley of the mine shells. Without the compact, hard-hitting firepower of the MG-131, the air campaign of 1943 would have been far less effective for the desperate enemy air force. The gun was their sharpest tooth in the face of overwhelming odds, Despite the exceptional engineering success and the terrifying efficiency of the MG-131 and its explosive Meninghiscos ammunition, the tide of the air war, inevitably and devastatingly, turned against the enemy air force. The ultimate deciding factor was not the quality of the weapons or the individual skill of the enemy pilots, but the overwhelming, relentless, and inexorable industrial capacity of the coalition powers. The defensive strategy, no matter how clever the weapon, simply could not overcome the sheer numerical superiority of the aircraft facing them in the skies. The enemy air force was fighting a war of attrition they were structurally incapable of winning. For every fighter lost, the coalition could quickly produce several high-performance escort fighters or heavy bombers. By late 1944, the enemy fighter force was being critically depleted, suffering unsustainable losses in both aircraft and irreplaceable veteran pilots. They were facing a new and ultimately insurmountable challenge: the long-range coalition escort fighter. This new strategic element fundamentally and permanently shifted the tactical balance of power high above the continental nation. The introduction of the main coalition escort fighter in massive numbers essentially neutralized the primary tactical advantage granted by the lightweight MG-131, the hit-and-run attack. This fighter had the range and performance to escort the heavy bombers all the way to targets deep within the nation, even to the capital, and guarantee their safe return. When enemy pilots tried to execute their fast, efficient, and lethal attack passes, they were no longer simply facing the concentrated, defensive guns of the bomber formation alone. They were intercepted, often many miles before they even reached the bomber stream, by highly disciplined, fast, and aggressive coalition escort fighters. The aerial combat quickly shifted from targeting bombers to a desperate struggle for survival against the escort pilots. The very speed and essential maneuverability that the MG-131's lightweight design preserved in the primary fighter was now desperately needed, not for the attack run itself, but for the pilots' frantic attempts at evasion and personal survival against this new, formidable foe. The enemy fighters, suddenly having to fight fiercely for their lives against the escorts, had little chance left to use their optimized bomber-killing guns. Their operational focus was tragically diverted from mission destruction to mere self-preservation. The devastating, high rate of fire of the MG-131 still ensured that any enemy pilot who managed to break through the fighter screens and reach the target remained a profoundly lethal threat. The weapon's lethality was not the issue. Access to the target was the core strategic problem. Yet, the enemy air force found itself trapped in a desperate, debilitating strategic cycle it could not escape. They were forced to divert increasingly scarce pilots and precious fuel resources to intercept the escort fighters, which in turn inevitably left the heavy bombers more exposed to the few fighters that remained. Even when successful in disrupting the escorts, the enemy fighter forces still suffered unsustainable losses against the superior numbers and strategic depth of the entire coalition air forces. Their pilot training pipeline was broken, and their fuel reserves were dwindling rapidly. By 1945, enemy fighter production had begun shifting massively towards specialized point defense interceptors armed with gigantic cannons. These designs focused on the 30mm weapon, often sacrificing rate of fire and even maneuverability entirely for sheer single-shot explosive power. This final strategic shift was less an evolutionary step forward and more a frantic, desperate attempt to survive by brute destructive force. It was a clear, tacit admission that the more balanced, precise approach epitomized by the MG-131 was now strategically obsolete in the face of complete coalition air dominance. The time for clever, aerodynamic compromises had sadly passed entirely. Nevertheless, the MG-131 left behind an indelible and important engineering legacy that influenced global post-war design philosophy. It stands historically as a prime example of the defending nation's absolute commitment to optimizing a weapon system for a very specific, demanding operational environment, often prioritizing economy and compactness over raw size. It was never the largest caliber weapon used in the air war, nor did it boast the deepest kinetic armor penetration compared to specialized armor-piercing rounds. Instead, its sheer brilliance lay in its elegant engineering compromise, fitting the maximum possible lethality in the form of the powerful explosive mine shell into the minimum possible volume. This critical feature ensured aerodynamic cleanliness and preserved the high-performance flight envelope for interceptor aircraft. It proved conclusively that a 13mm machine gun, previously considered far too light for serious anti-bomber work, could be fundamentally transformed into a terrifyingly effective killer through innovative and unconventional ordnance design. The weapon itself, often unjustly overlooked in the popular historical narrative in favor of the flashier, larger cannons, was in fact the indispensable workhorse. The MG-131 carried the core of the fight to the coalition heavy bomber stream during the most critical periods of 1943 and 1944. Its profound operational impact was studied extensively by coalition nations who meticulously examined the thin-walled, high-explosive aerial shell concept after the war concluded. This innovation directly influenced post-war aerial gun development across the world. It prompted other nations to radically rethink the optimal balance between shell casing, mass, and explosive filler volume for use against aluminum aircraft structures. The destructive efficiency of the 13mm weapon served as a permanent, chilling lesson in the power of ordnance innovation. The ugly little 13mm gun, designed for compactness and hidden firepower, was a testament to the desperate ingenuity born out of existential military necessity. It was a viciously effective solution to an impossible operational problem for a limited time, delaying the inevitable collapse of the defense. Its existence highlights the frantic, non-linear progression of technology during the conflict, showing that small, optimized innovations could yield massive tactical advantages. The gun was a powerful tactical equalizer for a time, a highly optimized tool that inflicted devastating losses and forced the coalition to radically rethink their operational vulnerability. Its destructive contribution to the war effort ensures it remains a grim but essential footnote in the history of aerial armament. The MG-131 reminded all combatants that in the relentless arms race of the Second World War, brute size was not always the deciding factor. Sometimes, the deadliest, most efficient punch came in the smallest, most cleverly designed and explosively augmented package. The memory of the shock and destruction it caused ensures its place in the annals of aerial warfare technology forever.